Bahir, and today's presentation will be held by Dr. Jill. She's originally from the United States, and she is now working for us as a professor in PhD in master's program. And in addition to her teaching responsibility, there are several things she's engaged in. And I think there is a long narration that I should read, but I better not. Should tell us a lot about herself. Yeah, that would be a better idea. So what I know is I think she has a long experience, teaching experience in several university schools in the United States and other countries, and she has been, I think she has been involved in several NGOs, and she has participated in Black Lives Matters movement. That if I remember correctly. So she has a long experience, teaching experience, and I hope will be benefited a lot from her presentation. I think that is what I can say very shortly. In addition, instead of stating her experience, it's better to give a chance for her to tell us about herself. So thank you for giving me the
Salam, good morning. It's right, Salam, right? Did I get it right? Okay. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm an artist, so artists are very temperamental in terms of wanting to make sure that our visuals and what we're going to use in our presentation is operating properly. So I apologize that some of my visuals are not and sound are not operating properly, because it is through images that you capture people's attention first, not through the spoken word. It is through images. And so some of the images that I just wanted to share with you that you're watching right now is that you're now in Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States. Baltimore, Maryland is near Washington, D.C., which is our capital. In 2015, there was a civil unrest, very similar to civil unrest that occurs in Ethiopia, where the local community, the local black community, exploded because of a killing of an individual by the name of Freddie Gray by the police. And so the work that I do, in addition to being a professor and an artist, I'm also a legal worker. And I'm trained to educate people to watch any kind of activity between police, law enforcement, security, and National Guard, military, in the protection of their First Amendment rights to protest. Right? And so I run out into the streets with thousands of other legal workers and attorneys to ensure, to the best of our ability, that people have the right to protest. It's one of our fundamental constitutional principles in the United States. And I also know from reading your Constitution that it is a fundamental principle here too, as you're developing your democracy in Ethiopia. So what I would like to share with you through images, because I'm a photographer and a videographer, going between images and the spoken word, taking you to the United States, where this movement has reemerged. This movement of African Americans, Black Americans, colored, Negroes, Africans, whatever term that we've been called in the context of migrating through forced migration to the United States, you're going to see this next generation involved in exercising their First Amendment rights to continue broadening our democratic rights for everyone in the United States. It's a long tradition, ever since people of African descent, ever since African folk got transported to the world, there's been resistance and there's been a broadening of the democratic space because of our Michigan struggle, which you are in fact connected to. So I'm going to take you through in a couple minutes and teach as a professor in Africa, because 30 years ago I taught as a secondary school teacher in Zimbabwe. At the age of 22, I went to go teach in Zimbabwe, and I've been traveling and doing work in Africa for the past 30 years. And I've had the opportunity to travel to about 15 African countries, all of the Spanish Caribbean, which is Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, parts of the other parts of the Caribbean, Barbados, South America, because there are African populations that have deposited in South America, so I've also been in Peru. So wherever there are African or people of African descent, I try to either go there, right, engage, interact with people, but to also study and do research. The work on African and people of African descent is worthy as an intellectual endeavor. It's incredibly important to understand that the intellectual work that you do influences the world. So I follow the Black radical tradition. My doctoral students and my master's students that were here will tell you that there's a set of philosophical assumptions that shape my worldview, which shapes the worldview of the Black radical tradition. And those philosophical assumptions are, first and foremost, that there is a cosmological relationship that I'm a part of, that I'm an interdependent being, right, that I am not separate from you, that I in fact engage you in multiple dimensions, that the work, the academic work that I do is for a purpose. I know my purpose. It is to initiate transformative change in the freedom of African and African descent people, but also other people who are fighting for freedom. So there are 7 philosophical assumptions that shape our worldviews. And I'm just sharing this with you because it's important that you understand why I'm here in front of you today discussing this work that I do. The Black radical tradition comes out of the first time that Africans were taken from their villages in West Africa, or Congo, and entered into the transatlantic slave, right? There's 3 slave markets that we know that crisscrossed the African continent, that brought folks from this continent and dispersed them to the Americas. The transatlantic slave trade, of which my ancestry comes from, the Indian Ocean, and the Arab slave trade. So you have Africans who got taken to every region of this continent and the world, dispersed through slavery or enslavement. What are the historical antecedents to Black resistance to state-led oppression and violence in the United States? Ever since Africans were taken through the transatlantic slave trade, there was resistance. People fought back, right? Not only did they fight back at the point of their villages being raided, they fought back on what's called the trek to the, they are called forts. If you have had the opportunity to visit West Africa, all along the coast of West Africa are forts that Europeans built to protect their geopolitical interests, right? Their trading routes. It's about trading routes. Who controls the trading routes, right? So as Africans got transported from their villages, trekked through these trading routes, as well as to the forts, which we now call slave dungeons, of which I've also visited, there was resistance, right? So this resistance begins a long time ago, before we even reached the Americas, what we call colonial America, right, that evolved into the United States, was built on indentured servitude, which is a labor arrangement where people sell their labor, right, for about 7 years. That includes European ethnic groups, national groups, including the Irish or the Gaelic, of which is part of my ancestry. The Africans that first came to these colonial spaces were not slaves. They were indentured servants. Slavery got phased into what we call early America, early colonial America. This is the beginning of the resistance. 21st century, African and people of African descent are still fighting against the level of oppression, right, for the extraction of our labor, because it's about free labor, right? The extraction of our labor in this new developing capitalist economy that developed, right, in the context of these trading colonial centers. So there's a long history of resistance. Models of mass defense. The way in which we resisted and organized, right? We're talking about political organizing, mobilizing communities. The way in which we contemporarily organize and mobilize our communities now against state-led level oppression and violence is that we build something that's called mass defense systems or legal support systems. All of these words are interchangeable. It simply means that we have a group of people who've been trained as attorneys, right? Who've been trained as legal observers like myself, and who've been trained to provide jail support, right? We've organized at the community level in order to do this work. These are called mass defense systems, right? So I just shared with you a little bit about how the human resources are organized. The systems that we build, in addition to organizing people, is that we use technology nowadays. Back in the day, you just talk to people, right? The civil rights movement, people talk to people, right? Face to face. We primarily met at churches in terms of where we did our organizing. The young folk that are organizing today, because they are some of the most technologically savvy individuals that I've met, use everything from WhatsApp, Viber, these are text messaging systems, right, to phones. But they are encrypted because we have to protect the information, right, that we are sharing, right? So we have developed a more efficient and effective way to organize ourselves in order to protect ourselves if we're going to engage in the First Amendment right to protest. The question that I have for you since I've come to Ethiopia is, to what extent can or should Ethiopian communities, right, need to learn, if they're not already doing it, because I haven't had a chance to actually study it systematically, building legal infrastructure to do the same type of work? Because I also know that there are individuals here and communities here that want to exercise their First Amendment right. So to what extent are any of these models that we use in the context of the US, right, can facilitate and assist Ethiopian communities in wanting to organize, educate their communities in the Constitution, look, to the extent that your population is educated, and I'm talking about their constitutional rights, right, makes you more effective in the political work you do, right? So when I'm stopped by the police, because I do know my rights, there are certain questions that I ask the police, and it signals to them that they know that I know my constitutional rights, right? And so the police may be less likely to, in fact, violate your rights if you have a highly educated population. I mean, from whatever age on up. We educate our kids, right, very young on up. Right, so it's important to know your rights, particularly as you're thinking about the ways in which you're going to address these issues of protecting and maintaining your democratic rights in the context of Ethiopia. So the question for me is, to what extent can you learn both ways? Can we learn both ways in building these mass defense systems? The work that I do is part of a larger political project. As I shared with you, my philosophical assumptions that shape my intellectual work is because there's a political agenda behind it, and that is the freedom of African and people of African descent. I don't care where we live, right? And so part of the work I do is that I work transnationally. Not only do I work across the United States in different Black communities, I work transnationally. So I have a colleague in England, Kevin Cobham, who is a barrister and a solicitor in England who works with Afro-Caribbean and African immigrant populations. And we've had conversations about, to what extent can we build these same systems in England, Portugal, Spain, France, because in those communities you have immigrant African and Caribbean populations that are also experiencing various degrees of state-level violence, right, by the police. So I developed a course. I invited him to co-teach with me. He's in England, I'm in the US. Thank God for technology, right? And online, to be able to develop courses online. So Kevin and I have developed a course. This course is called Black Transatlantic Communities, Building Legal Empowerment. The primary purpose now, because I'm no longer in the street since I'm older, I can still outrun the millennials. The primary purpose that I'm playing now is that I am actually educating the next generation of African and people of African descent to understand how to build these systems. So in addition to the practical, technical skill set, because it's very technical, it's technical in the sense of we have attorneys who have the legal knowledge. I know attorneys all over the world. They are our legal egos. They have the legal knowledge in terms of being able to confront governments, right, when our rights are violated, or even before our rights are violated. Right? So I work with attorneys like Kevin. I also work with, I just met him. I had a conversation with him. He's doing the photography. Thank you. The first thing I asked him when I found out that he did STEM, the first thing I asked him was, can you build relational databases? Can you build remote means it's in the cloud, relational databases, because that's the infrastructure in order to do this work transnationally, right? So I find people who have these skill sets, I immediately recognize their skill sets, organize them, bring them together in a project team, and transnationally, I've been building these systems, and now I have a course that I just taught last semester where the next generation, right, is learning the importance of their constitutional rights, how to build these systems. This is how you build human capital, right? I'm sharing with you, this is the way, and I have no money. Let me just make this clear. I'm an adjunct faculty. I am not tenured. I've been adjunct faculty for the past my entire academic career, and I'm fine with that because I have a level of flexibility to do the work that I want to do, right? But think creatively about your skill sets. One of the questions that we had when I first met you all was, to what extent is the Friday faculty seminar useful to you? You have no idea that you have a learning community. You have a think tank that can be developing all kinds of systems, not just for Ethiopia, but for the Horn of Africa, for connecting to the world, whatever your particular area of interest is. So this is just a model of how to do that. So as I shared with you, why are Black Americans organizing against state-led, particularly police violence? Let me just be very clear. The police are adjunctive to the state. My PhD is in public administration, right? So the police are public administrators, they are civil servants, they are public servants, they are accountable to us, the people, right? They're an extension of the state, which is us, the people, right? I have to kind of share with you a little bit about the history of the US, the development of the political economy of the US, that's our political system, and our economic system. In order for you to understand why the United States is about, you all help me, my US colleagues, we're about 300 years old, 250, 300 years old, right, as the United States. The colony, of course, is much older, 1600s, right? The United States is primarily influenced by what's called a slave economy, slaveocracy, right? So when you have a colony, you need labor. I shared with you earlier that many of these colonies that European countries, right, set up, whether the trading posts, the Dutch set up trading posts, the British and the French set up settler colonies. There's a difference, different purpose, right? In the context of, you're looking at the United States, right? So in the context of the United States, we grew out of a slaveocracy. This is the slaveocracy, the South, right? The original 13 colonies were in the Northeast, but the first successful colony was Jamestown, Virginia. 1600s, Jamestown, Virginia. It's not the first colony in what we call the Americas. The Spanish set up a colony in what we know as Florida, but it did not survive because of the rebellions, and maroon communities were set up, right? But for the most part, the United States was built on the back of indentured servitude and slavery. Indentured servitude is a labor arrangement, as I shared with you. European national groups, as the capitalism developed, for those of you who are interested in the history of capitalism, you really need to study what happened to European communities, like the enclosures, the moving people off of the commons, the ability to grow their own food, right? So you had mobile populations that sold their labor. You had excess labor now. It was mobile, so people went to the New World. They basically said for 7 years, they signed a contract called indentured servitude, and they would work for whomever owned them for 7 years, but after they did that 7 years, they then could become part of the polity, the larger society. That included Africans and Europeans, because there were Africans in Europe, folks, for centuries, right? So you had populations of indentured servitude. What happened such that indentured servitude was phased out, and we phased in slavery, chattel slavery. Slavery is a very, very old system, labor arrangement. It is part of the old world. There's different types of slavery, right? Chattel slavery is very specific because it marks you for life and your progeny for life, right? It is a marker for life in terms of creating a caste, permanent caste system to exploit your labor. As we're developing these colonies, right, we need cheap labor or no cost labor at all. The South is the engine, or was the engine, in terms of providing that cheap labor for the financial markets that grew in the Northeast. So New York is one of our major global financial markets, but it's rooted in slavery, right? So the political economy of the U.S. comes out of U.S. slavery. It created an imperative to organize slave patrols, because you've got to control people who are going to run away from enslavement. People don't want to be enslaved. That's just a natural human, right, reaction. So you have to create another labor group of people, social class of people, who are going to control, right, these other groups of people. And so slave patrols grows out of this slaveocracy, right, with the plantocracy. It creates an economic incentive under capitalism to hunt, return, or kill Africans legally codified as chattel property. Africans up until about 1650 were not classified as slaves. They were indentured servants. John Punch is the first African who was an indentured servant, who owned slaves, right, or owned other indentured servants, right? So we clearly see that the idea to develop a new labor arrangement developed because of this imperative. The slave owners, right, the landowners, realized that if they were able to separate all of these workers, we're workers, folks, if we're able to create division, right, amongst you, which is what they did, right, we can now exploit this population of labor. People ran away. The Irish, my ancestry, Africans, my ancestry, the Cherokee and the Creek, my ancestry, they all ran away and created maroon communities. But the way in which they began to put separation between these body of workers was to say, phase in what they call this group of people, the Irish, particularly men, because it's a gendered story. The Irish men can own guns, rifles. The African and the native cannot. We just made a distinction. Those who can own guns are now part of the polity. They can't own land yet, and they can't vote. Voting is based on land ownership. But there's a distinction now, a little bit of a distinction. Not only that, when people fled away or got married, inter-ethnic marriages, because race as a social construct had not developed yet, how we organize ourselves in the modern world, race was not part of that organizing principle. I was Igbo, I was Yoruba, I was Bakongo, right? I was Gaelic, I was Cherokee, I was Creek. They introduced something else called a racial color system, right? So what they did was they said, all people from that continent over there, which was called Africa, are now going to be racialized as black. That it doesn't matter if you're Igbo, Congo, Shona, Ndebele, Tonga, doesn't matter. You're now black. These group over here, who are Gaelic, which is Irish, right? The Gaelic, the English, the Germans, you are now white. And the way you learned that was you can own guns, you cannot. You're no longer, once you do your 7 years of indentured servitude, and it's over, you can participate in the polity, you are now enslaved for life. You will never be part of the political political community or social community, right? That's what racial hierarchies are. They're socially constructed ways to create divisions among people, to classify them, right? Clumping people together, and to exploit their labor. Because remember, the underlying rationale is that we need your labor to do all this work, agricultural work, because we're going to now sell these cash crops to what's now called the northern part of our colonies, that produces them into fine goods, right, added value, and we're going to now sell in the international global market, in a nutshell. So we see over a 50, 100-year period, from the 1600s to the 1700s, the development of the slaveocracy. We have that documented. If an Englishman or primarily an Irish man marries an African woman, he gets 20 lashes. So now they're teaching you, even if you decide, right, to have inter-ethnic or international relationships, right, nationalities, you're going to be punished. Right? So you get the idea in terms of how racialism or racial categories evolve, but also coupled with colorism. Right? Colorism means that if you have a child that's biracial, that child is worth more than just an African child because he's lighter in color, he or she is lighter in color and closer to those who are the owners, right, the plantocracy. So now we've introduced colorism in addition to a racial caste system, because now what the plantocracy owners did, and this is gendered, the men raped African women, and the children that were produced, in order to make sure that the children could not make claims, what's called patrilineal or patrimonial claims on the father, they changed the laws and said you can no longer make patrilineal claims of ownership of land, because land was like transferred to children, right? The status of your mother now determines your status, right? So understand that there's a whole system, legal framework, that was established, including the Constitution. Our founding paper doesn't mention Africans by name, but it mentions us by the particular political purpose we played, because the South wanted to make sure that its property would be counted in its census for voting purposes. Right, so we're considered 3/5 of a human being. That's codified, what's codified in our Constitution. Doesn't mention us by name. The only name of group nationality, because they're sovereign nations, are the indigenous people that are mentioned in the Constitution by name, right? We're mentioned by numerical purpose, right, in our political system, significance. We also see the development of several laws. Now look, if I'm a slave owner, I want to make sure that if my property decides to leave and flee, that the non-slave holding states in the Midwest, what we call the Midwest, were not slave owning states. If my property runs to, or ships themselves, because there are cases where, there's a famous case called the box case, where a black man, puts himself into a trunk and ships himself to a non-slaving owning part of the country. But there's a set of laws that protect the plantocracy. The Dred Scott case of 1857 that says, basically, slaves or chattel property have no rights because you're chattel property. You're not a human. Your property. So it allows me to basically claim my property back. Dred Scott decision, right? So we have a number of legal decisions. We've got a legal framework that's protecting the interest of these slave owners. Black codes. Kind of shared with you the black codes. Basically, it strips all people of African descent. It is my African activity that marks me in the United States. My African activity first, and then my racialization. So I'm stigmatized because of my connection to you all, right? I'm stigmatized in the context of the United States under this development of this political economy, legal framework. And the black codes are the ways in which it strips people of African descent of their social rights. If now a white man is walking down the street and they're an African man or woman, or now this time African American man or woman, they have to move off the sidewalk. It's the standard convention. Right? So all of these social, cultural, legal, economic ways in which you control and suppress and extract the labor of people of Africans and African descent. There's something called the libidinal economy. So in addition to the economic rationale for the need for cheap labor and the ways in which to construct, right, socially construct identities, right, to extract people's labor and control them, there is something else that developed. The emotional and psychological and the affective, right, economy that derives and comes out of being able to suppress a group of people. It makes me feel good because I'm on top. That's the libidinal economy. It makes me feel good that I know that you've got to get off the sidewalk because I'm on top. See, the Irish were racialized as black centuries before they came to the Americas by the English, because the English colonized, right, Ireland. They racialized them as black. And if you look at the early images of how the English depicted the Irish, it is identical to the way in which the English now are depicting people of African descent. They're monkeys, they're primates. It's called the chain of being, right? And they show the images, right? So the Irish have a memory of being racialized and suppressed and oppressed, right? Way before they got to the Americas. And so for them, the way in which they can participate in this new society is to, right, take part in this oppression of another group of people. It doesn't mean that they all did, because there's a national liberation conscience in Ireland, right? But for the most part, in the context of the US, they participated in that as they became white.
It is a process. My ancestors became black. They were Igbo, they were Yoruba, they were Bakongo. They realized they were black because they could not go to school, they could not work in certain labor niches, they could not engage in now racial relationships. Their children could be sold. They learned, they became black, just like the Irish and the English and the French became white, right? But at the end of the day, W. Du Bois, one of our premier scholars, called it the psychological wages of whiteness, right? So the political economy that Petty developed in terms of carving up Ireland basically said, the Irish, we're gonna pay them half of a penny. Well, the Africans are worth less than that, so we're gonna pay them a quarter of a penny, right? But the English, they don't get the full penny, right? Right? So even if it's this amount, whether it's economically or emotionally or effectively, right? This is the way we train and create new populations, right, in this new economy and our new society called what now is the United States. All of these factors contributed to what we know today is called anti-black racism. It's a different variant than Islamophobia. Islamophobia comes out of a different contextual process, right? It's different than Native Americans, the way in which Native Americans are stigmatized in our country as sovereign nations, right? Anti-black racism is rooted in my ancestral nativity of coming from the African continent, because the African continent is the dark continent, right? Anti-black racism codifies, right, and marks people of African descent as forever being slaves. Slavery ended in 1865 with our Civil War and the abolishment of slavery, the 13th Amendment. But people, when they see me, they know, oh, her ancestors were slaves. That's the first thing. A lot of it is unconscious. So now, folks, remember this is taking place over a 102-year process. People are being socialized into these systems. And so a lot of this history gets lost. But now we're still enacting the same behaviors, right, in terms of how we treat different populations and groups of people. The one-drop rule arose after the emancipation or the ending of slavery. The one-drop rule means this: if your great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was of African ancestry, you're black. Even if you look like this. Right? So my sister is very fair. My sister is very fair. She perhaps looks like Rachel. But because she has one drop of African blood, even though, folks, listen to this, there is no biological marker for race because race is socially constructed. It changes across time and space. You're marked, right, as black. So now there's another way to mark us through blood. This is the development of what we know as biological racism, developed out of the field of anthropology during the 19th century, right? So what we have in developing anti-black racism is the codification, the legal codification of the role of Africans. We have the development of modern-day racism, the one-drop rule, in creating this, what's called racial capitalism. Capitalism is racialized, but it's also gendered, right? This is what informs our modern-day police. The slave patrols grew out of this. So the Irish, who at one time were indentured servants and shared the fields with African and Native people, now were given a new role to control these populations. They were the modern-day police, primarily coming out of the South. They were called paddy patrols. Paddy is a negative term to refer to Irish people. Paddies comes out of their oppression, right, and enslaved by the English. Paddy rollers, right? So this is the way in which anti-black racism that informs the modern-day police system, because the South had such a prominent role in our development, right? And slavery has such a prominent role, right, in the development of the United States. So today, right, this is Baltimore, Maryland. So I just took you about 300-400 years of history. I'm in Baltimore, Maryland, and I'm observing the way in which the police interact with black people. Because we are not human, we do not feel pain. These are all of the notions about somehow we are biologically and physically different than other groups of people, that we're not human, right? So it is okay to pepper spray. It's okay to pepper spray.
right? It's okay to enact all kinds of force on our bodies because we're not human, right? Some of the gendered sexual stereotypes. So the stereotypes that came out of enslavement is Jim Crow, right? We're silly. Black men are silly. Basically, Jim Crow is a period of our history. We have these images. Jim Crow because we're silly. We're not intelligent. Black men or African men are rapists. Their libido is out of control, particularly when it comes to their need, right, to rape white women, right, who are at the top of our racial gender hierarchy, a particular type of white women, because you have working class white women who are not considered, right, at the top because of their working position, their class position, right? Class is another factor, race, gender, and class that shapes the United States. The mammy. So the mammy, this is the libidinal economy. Look, the mammies and the Uncle Remuses were the ones who took care of the white children. Matter of fact, most of the white children that grew up on plantocracies were raised by the mammies. The mammies basically put aside all of their feelings to raise these white children above their own children. And they were asexual, right? So there's a sexualized component. The Jezebel. African women can be raped. That stereotype and that stigma still applies to us today. Not in the United States, but all over the world. Where I travel, people approach me because they think I'm a prostitute because I'm sitting in a restaurant at night by myself, having a beer, drinking a cup of tea. Something about me being an African woman, right, entices men. And as a result, I can't be raped. So I cannot go to the court of law. Right? If you study jurisprudence and the way in which African women, African American women, in the context of the US, are treated if they are sexually assaulted, there are these assumptions that you did something, right, to entice men. The Jezebel stereotype, and that's what this is. These are images that we still have today, that we still suffer with. The Bantu. I find it interesting being here in Ethiopia because I study racial classification systems, and I've been trying to figure out and understand, is there a racial classification system that developed in the context of Ethiopia? Because I hear terms like Hamitic, Kushites, Bantus, and to what extent do these different classifications occupy certain labor niches? Right? So Bantus is the stereotypical image that people have of what's African. Bantus are dark. Bantus probably come from like the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Bakongo. They're dark, they have thick lips, right? They have kinky hair, right? And so those of us who have the Bantu-based features, Stephen Biko of South Africa is a classic Bantu physiology, right? Stephen Biko of South Africa, he was beaten to death. If you know South African history, Stephen Biko was beaten to death. He is the founder, one of the founders of the Black Consciousness Movement. But he represents what's called the standard Bantu feature. They're scary-looking people. Unlike the Hamitic, right, who the Catholic Church racialized as the premier African classical group, lean, tall, aquiline nose, right, closer to European-looking features. Mental development, African people, childlike. These are classical images that I grew up on. I remember watching cartoons as a child, but I didn't know that I was being socialized and codified, right, as being thought of as I'm childlike. I don't care what age you are, you're forever a child, right? So whites were able to call individuals who were 80 years old by their first names, right? Because we're forever childlike. Inherently violent. African men black men are inherently violent. It is something about your nature that we have to lock you up. We have to control your behavior because you're forever going to attack. You're violent. And of course, Sarcha Bartman, she was, you have to know, son, you lived in South Africa, the Khoi. Right, so she was taken from her people and put on display in Europe because she exhibited the classical, what's called stereotypes. And she was put on display. Right, and if you go to South Africa, you'll actually see the cast that they made of her body. Not just of her behind, but of her vaginal area. Every aspect, right, of African people has been picked, right, classified, and considered aberrant right, in opposition to Europeans. There's something about us, whether it's our mental capacity, whether it's our sexuality, whether it's our physical bodies, that sets us apart from the rest of other individuals in humanity. What does that mean? Because remember, the focus is, what does this mean in terms of how the police react to black people, right? It informs, all of this informs the way the police, but not just the police, it informs the way our society, in the context of the United States, reacts to black people or people of African descent. Fear. So we now know, let me go back to this. Sorry about that. We now know, we now have the science, right? Because I'm a social scientist. I understand the game, right? So even though I know the social history of the United States, in order to have empirical evidence that the way people react to people of African descent and those who've been codified as black, is that there is a reactive part of our brain that we can now look at and test, right? And so neuroscientists have been looking at this for a very long time. And they developed something called the implicit association test. The implicit association test, in a nutshell, is the limbic part of our brain, which is our old brain, which is our primitive brain, reacts when we are fearful, when we see something that scares us, right? We can be socialized into becoming fearful about people, right? And so that's why this test is so important, right? And I would encourage you to take this. I have my students take this test, right? What it does is it identifies and maps your unconscious attitudes and stereotypes about groups of people. What happens is you're sitting in a controlled setting and pictures get flashed, right? Pictures associated with terms, good, bad, dangerous, right? And then they monitor the activity of your amygdala, which is a small little, very important, that right there, very important, right? But it reacts, right? When it sees something or feels something or smells something, because it's sensitive, that causes you fear, right? That's sort of the basis of it. Whites score the highest on implicit association tests than all other racial groups when they see pictures of primarily black men get the highest reactivity, right? All people react negatively or in terms of their scores when they see black people, so they show flashes of Indian folk who supposedly look Indian from Indian cotton, right? Supposedly folk who are white, supposedly folk who are black. Remember folks, it's a social construction. Racial categories are social construction. We are taught to associate people, right? And they look and measure the reactivity to different parts, particularly the limbic system, the amygdala. Whites score the highest, right? What does this mean in the context of not just policing, but teaching? I am an educator, and I will be very honest with you. I have stereotypes and biases about students, right? If I hear students speak a certain way with a particular accent, let's say Spanish accent, right? Or if they grammatically, if they pronounce words in a way that's not grammatically correct, right? The difference is I'm aware of those biases, right? In terms of, will I grade them differently because I recognize that they might be from someplace else, right? So it doesn't just affect police, it affects every institution, because these are social institutions made up of human beings that we operate in, right? So education, policing, whatever institution you're in, you carry a set of implicit or unconscious attitudes and biases about groups of people. In this context, the police, regardless of color, because it's the role that they've been socialized to play, and they live in an anti-black world, right, interact with black people differently in their day-to-day work as police, right? And so we see a disproportionate number of killings of black people. White people, by population, make up more of the United States. And so by population, by numerical numbers, white folk are also being killed by the police
because they just make up a natural larger population. But blacks are disproportionately, we're 13% of the population, but we make up a disproportionate number of the killings, and we make up a disproportionate number of those who go into the criminal justice or criminal legal system or our jails. Right? That's the issue with my statisticians in the house, the numerical people, the post-positive people. Right? That's the issue. Not just the numerical number, but the disproportionate number. Right? Sandra Bland and Eric Garner. Sandra Bland had an interaction with the law enforcement in the South. He was in Atlanta. She was arrested, but she did not come out alive. Eric Garner, where I lived for 12 years in New York, was killed in Staten Island. This is a video. I chose not to show the video of him being murdered, and I use the term murdered, because this is an illegal procedure. The police, this is NYPD, New York Police Department, police departments across the country are not supposed to use this chokehold. It cuts off your cardiac, right? They know that. It is a legal procedure. Watch the video, right? If you want to viscerally understand, right, what's going on in the context of the United States. Hence, why today you see young people who are poured out in the streets to protest against these continuing 300, 400-year practices of people of African descent who've been racialized as black in the context of the United States. I had to kind of take you through the history so that you understand how deeply rooted anti-black racism and violence is in the context of the United States. You coming to the US, possibly because you're racially codified, you are all racially, you look like my brother, you look like my sister, right? Puts you at risk. Very quickly, there are so many incidences, this is a timeline. There are so many incidences in the context of the development of the colonial, what we know, America, United States, right? And what I tried to do is just identify what I thought were key, right, periods in our history. The ending of slavery, the development of Jim Crow. As soon as slavery ended, 13th Amendment abolished slavery, the landowners had to figure out a way to still control the labor of this population now that's free. And so they came up with a system, right, called convict labor, the passage of vagrant laws. So you've got all these free people who once enslaved, who now have to figure out what they're going to do. They're classified now as vagrants and can be arrested and put back into a system of extracting their labor, right? The classic civil rights movement. I was born at the end of the Second Reconstruction, which is basically the second time that we passed the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. The first time was 1867, right after the ending of our Civil War, and because the Confederacy rose again, which is the South, the plantocracy, African Americans' rights were suppressed, and it wasn't until 1964 and 65 that we had the right to franchise, to vote, and that our civil rights were protected again under the law. With that comes the rise of what's called the carceral state. We've got to figure out a way, once again, to control this population. Africans have always been commodities in the context of the United States. So one way now that we see that these bodies are still commodities is that there's the development of the prison system. Please understand that prisoners provide cheap labor, right? So you have to have people charted into this, tracked into this system in order to continue to produce this cheap labor, right? To make products that get sold, right? And so that's what the development of the carceral state is. And then 2016, with the election and the winning of the White House, Trump represents the rise of the Confederacy. The Confederacy, folks, is our historical social class, a group of individuals who basically are the plantocracy class. The Confederacy, I believe, from a regime perspective, is now basically has control of all of our institutions. The executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch is now governed by the Confederacy, which is this. That is my belief and understanding. I'm going to skip this video.
and go straight to what it is I do. Can someone give me a time check, please?
10:15.
Thank you. So, given that context, right, you are now in the United States. You've just gone through our social history, understanding the legal frameworks, the economic frameworks, the libidinal economy. What do I do? So I'm a 15-year legal observer with the National Lawyers Guild. The National Lawyers Guild is the oldest civil liberties law association in the country. They are the radical group, progressive, I'm going to say radical group of attorneys that protect everyone's rights, including the rights of individuals that are incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay. They fundamentally believe that human rights supersede property rights, right? And that everyone's rights should be protected. So that's what I've been doing for 15 years, in addition to being a professor, is running in the streets of New York, observing thousands of actions between NYPD and everyday citizens. New York is like the capital of protests, every day, right? So that's my background in terms of doing this work. Not only did I get that training in New York, because of the explosion that occurred after Trayvon Martin killing, was another young man who was killed. There was a mass mobilization of young black people that said they've had enough. This is the millennial generation that didn't grow up under Jim Crow. So they don't have a day-to-day experience of Jim Crow and oppression that way. But they do have an experience of aggression by the police. And this young group of people decided they'd had enough, and they began to protest all across the United States. I got a call and asked, could I come to Baltimore to train a couple things. One, to develop a rapid response legal system and to train people to be legal observers. I said yes, Baltimore, right? Because of the Freddie Gray incident, was killed. I get to Baltimore thinking that I was going to be with a group of National Lawyers Guild members because that's who I work with. No, it was 5 people. There was a decision made by individuals across the country that black folk and other folk of color need to start doing this work and not relying primarily on a white institution, progressive institution, to do this work that impacts our lives. And there's enough of us who have the skill sets and the knowledge bases to do this. Folk knew that I did this work. That's how I ended up in Baltimore. The 5 of us built a rapid response legal system in 2 days, and what that means is we had to design a database that was going to collect information for arrestees, and we're talking about hundreds of people who got arrested. We had to figure out a way to identify and organize attorneys for free who would offer free legal service for arrestees. And then my primary job was I had to train hundreds of people to be legal observers and to turn them out on the street. We did it, right? And so from that, I started getting invited all over the country to do this work. I'm the only African American woman, gendered, right, that does this work at that level. My training as a social scientist provides the framework for me to be able to rapidly build these systems because I'm drawing from my social science training and work, right? And the work I did in Southern Africa, building and learning about rapid response healthcare systems, right? How do you provide those in the context of Southern Africa when South Africa was still exporting its violence in the frontline states? So I transferred that knowledge from my African experience to a US experience. So I started traveling around the country. I built these systems, worked with people. Baltimore Legal Defense Committee, it is still operating. The National Conference of Black Lawyers, the New York chapter, wanted to reinvigorate its LO, right, capacity. Basically, I showed them the design elements and how to do this. NCBL now has a chapter. I trained almost all of the black people in the city of New York to be legal observers. A whole new generation that know how to do this work. Los Angeles, which is my hometown, I got called in. Los Angeles did the same thing. The majority of black people that have been trained across the United States, I've trained them. Baltimore, New York, Cleveland, Chicago, Los Angeles. Folks, this is the work I've been doing. It's about organizing. Gotta organize. Have to organize people. You have to mobilize people, right? And you have to make sure people's skill sets develop. So this is a training. right? This is a police baton. I am trained to systematically monitor and surveil the police. I know that when the police do this, that their next step's gonna do this. Because I've seen so many police formations across the country that I can anticipate, right? When they do one thing, they're gonna do this, right? That's the level of knowledge and skill set that you want a political party or group of people to have, including, there's something else. Are my Know Your Rights? Can I pull up my Know Your Rights pamphlets? Here they are. So in addition to having the technical skill sets of how to read police formations, you need people who know their legal rights. We produce these booklets in English, Spanish, Arabic. We produce them like in almost 7 different languages, and when I'm out there in the streets, I am passing these out to people, right? Everyday folk, right? So that they know their rights. This is invaluable knowledge, information for developing a population's capacity to protect their democratic rights. It's something that you have to do, right? So in addition, I help people get used to, excuse me, ma'am, do I have permission to touch you?
Yes.
Look, when you're on the street, folks, with police, not only are you going to get, right, hit with a baton, right? I've been shoved, I've been pushed. Thank God I've never gotten seriously hurt and never been arrested in the line of doing this work, but I do have friends who have, who are legal observers. You've got to get used to, it's rough, folks, it's rough. You've got to get used to seeing people get beat, right? So I had post-traumatic stress syndrome. It's called secondary post-traumatic stress syndrome from watching people being abused, right? So these are just some of in my training, right, I take people through these steps so they get used to it before they get out there on the street and have to encounter it, right? What happens when you get pepper sprayed, right? So my old school activist, Gil, right? Thank you, Gil, for training, right? I'm giving my due acknowledgement. Gil, put it in water. Old school activist, if you get pepper sprayed, right, gassed, right? So I have a backpack that I carry, a little tiny backpack. I call it my Elo backpack. It has everything in it from a first aid kit to gloves, fire retardant gloves, because folks, what's happening, in one of the photos you'll see, I'm at a site of civil unrest where things are being burned down to the ground. So with fire retardant gloves, right? All of this to prepare you, right? So the components is to educate, to organize, to mobilize, to train community members in mass defense, and to build these systems, which I've called legal protection civil disobedience systems. A nice word to say a mass defense system, legal infrastructure, right? What are the components? Very quickly. We're out there to protect people's rights. Fundamental basics of democracies, emerging democracies. The United States is a consolidated democracy, but we are still emerging. There is no ideal, you've reached the ideal. We are still, right, developing a democracy, right? You need to have attorneys. Folks, since I've been here, I'll share this with you. Last weekend, I spent my entire 4 days, thinking I was going to arrest an artist, experiencing your federal high court system. Specifically, you're criminal, not civil, right? I was playing court, jail, and bail support. I know your system now. I've experienced a little bit of your system now in terms of watching my friend, right? And because of my training, I'm able to map systems really quickly and can facilitate and assist. But you've got to have attorneys who know the system in order to get people in and out of the system. Otherwise, people can get lost. Your system is very different than ours in terms of, at least I will say in the context of the US, if you were incarcerated, you know you're going to get 3 meals and a cot. Here, people had to physically bring food, right? So we had to physically take food every day to our friend who was incarcerated, right? And a blanket. It's not as nice as the US in terms of the the jail system. The point is this: you've got to learn how to work with attorneys. I'm a legal worker. You've got to learn how to work with jail support to be able to do this work. What are the three systems of a relational database? All of this information gets stored in a relational database. This is the technical piece. My computer folk who have built my model mass defense system, right? So we've got the legal support, our attorneys who do the external affairs, interact with politicians, they write all the op-eds, deal with the media, provide the legal support. You've got me, who basically trains legal observers, right? There are different types of legal observers. There are those legal observers who train in human rights and civil rights. I'm primarily trained in civil rights, but I'm familiar with human rights in terms of observing, protecting constitutional rights, in terms of observing and documenting law enforcement. And then you've got jail support. Once you get incarcerated, this gets turned, my job is done primarily. Once people get into the system, there's a whole other group of people who now go to the jails, which is what I did. Go to the jails, make sure the person is there, get all the information, go visit, right, the jail, see the person, right, find out that they're okay, if they need medical assistance, right, track their case all the way through. Appear, make court appearances, which is what I did, but they also pay bail, which is what I did, right? That's the jail and court support system. This is a system. It's a well-oiled system. And when it works well, folks, we get people in and out. We're talking about hundreds of people. We get people in and out of jail, right? And fundamentally, we do know your rights trainings, hence the booklets that I showed you, and civil disobedience trainings. This is the system, right? This is Baltimore. In order for me to do this work, folks, I have to interact with people from these communities because the people who are on the ground know the communities the best. So I'm in Baltimore, and we're having a meeting because these men, and particularly Shaka, who is my bodyguard, because I'm not from Baltimore, I lived in New York, right? They were briefing us where the hot spots are going to be in terms of things popping off during the civil unrest. Where were the gangs going to turn out because they wanted to fight with the police? Gangs, right? The Bloods, the Crips, right? And so on our wall was a map with where they have put a little X to indicate you got to get your LOs out of here because by this time the Bloods and the Crips are going to roll out and they're going to basically fight with the police. This is the level, I'm telling you just on the ground how it really works. This is the level of detail and types of relationships that you have to build. Having a PhD and saying you're doctor this and that does not get you any street cred in this context. People don't know I have a PhD. When they found out I had a PhD, they were shocked because they just said, you're incredibly humble. You are incredibly humble, right? That I applied my knowledge and skill set that I got from that training to work with people, but I work with people in a horizontal way, in a very egalitarian way, right, folks? So there's a different way in which we organize and work together in doing this work effectively. It is a feminine model of leadership skills that if I draw from yours paper that I read, building horizontal egalitarian relationships, right? Being accountable. I'm a guest in their community, so I take direction from the local community in terms of, first of all, we get invited to do this work. Second of all, if they don't want us to roll out on the street, we won't go out there, right? So being accountable to the communities that you're trying to serve and be in solidarity with in doing this work, and making sure that it's sustainable. The Baltimore structure that you put up doing the civil unrest is still up and running. It's expanding, including the one I built in Los Angeles. How did I do this? Very quickly, folks, I built strategic partnerships for my business people in the room, my new public management people in the room. I have to work with other actors, right? Other nonprofit actors, business community, who have the technical skill set. I am not a programmer. I don't do all this network, the actual physical stuff, but I have relationships with people who do. They provided me, their business, ECI Networks, provided me the technical knowledge and the space, the iCloud space, to build this remote database, right? Because they supported my work. Not that they had to be in the street with me, but they supported the fundamental, right, idea that our democratic rights should be protected. This is what this database does and how it's designed, right? It manages all of the support data, human capital, arrests, anything else, media, assets. It's relational, so if I need to search, I can be sitting at home, I can access it through the graphic user interface, or web-based interface. I can easily pull up the arrestee information. I can easily pull up the LOs. I can easily pull up the attorneys, right? All of this makes up this database. These are just some of the specifications. And I know it's detailed, but for the most part, this is a model of what you want to build, right? Possibly build. More importantly, it was at the bottom, it is a secure and encrypted database, which means that it makes it incredibly difficult for the police or even hackers, right, to crack into it. It's really important because you have sensitive arrestee information, right? So it's cross-reference databases, it collects the attorney profiles, it collects the legal observer information, and specifically my role, because I have information of arrests. I'm on the front line. This is actually the most important piece, is to get that initial documentation of when you've been arrested, because I'm that initial eyewitness. Making sure that my notes are written a certain way, that are then uploaded into this database, and now the attorneys can come and look at it, and the jail support can look at it. More specifically, once it gets handed off, it is the attorneys that determine to what extent, if we have to go to court, right, that my notes can be used in a court of law to protect, right, or to defend people to get them out. This is what it looks like. This is the architecture. So you're looking at my techies, you're looking at the ground level of the database. You've got your variables, all my folk who do my research methods class, right? So you've got your variables, right? Different categories. You're going to be putting it there. It's right there. Arrestee, legal observer, right? These are some of the reference tables. Stores legal observer information. Legal observer information used to organize and deploy people into the streets. It's a portal so we can upload information. Because I'm a social scientist, one of the issues that constantly we heard from attorneys was, we don't know who the LOs are, because we're not out there. We can't even use their information, even if it is good. I thought about it and I said, oh, it's a linkage problem. Well, why don't we create some kind of code that identifies the LOs, that then if they search this code, whether it's by the day of arrest or by the arrestee name, it's linked to the legal observer. Boom, resolved, right? That's how you can use your technical skill set as both scholars, researchers, technical people to work with communities. This is a think tank, right? So in terms of building the capacity of our local communities here in Bahir, you guys have this expertise to do this wide range of work. And then finally, folks, for those of you who only want to deal with the user interface, the website, you know, like you can sit there, this is it. This is a record. This is me. I'm a legal observer, right? Somebody put the information in for me, and if you pulled up my record, I'm a legal observer, right? Here's my data, contact information, areas of expertise, boom. So I just walked you through the entire process of building a rapid response legal system and what you would see at the end, right? If you're sitting at home. This is the last section, folks, I think, yeah. Very quickly, I do legal observer trainings. They're normally about an hour and a half, right? These are just a few slides that show you the trainings that I do. The purpose, it is incredibly important to educate people what the purpose of being a LO is. We're there to be this neutral entity that observes and documents the police, which represents the government in the protection of people's rights to demonstrate. That is our role, which means that my political interests, right, are not to be exhibited in the street, because in the event that I have to testify in a court of law, the first thing that they're going to try to do is undermine my credibility. I do not want to give them anything to do that. Right, so when I'm out there legal observing, I'm real clear in terms of how I conduct myself as a legal observer and the role that I'm playing. So we don't wear like slogans, right? We only wear these green hats that indicate everybody, for the most part, the states that we work in or the locales we work in, folk know us by the green hats. We are legal observers for the National Lawyers Guild, or by the orange hats. We are legal observers for the National Conference of Black Lawyers, or by the purple hats, we are legal observers for Justice Warriors for Black Lives. That's our signifier. The police know us. The politicians know us, right? It shifts the police behavior in terms of what they think they can get away with. So folks, as I shared with you, you never know who's watching you. You recognize this person? You guys recognize this person? She's standing right in front of you. Right, remember I shared with you that I wear a LO backpack and I wear a green hat? So I'm in Baltimore. There were so many images of me walking in the civil unrest in Baltimore. My phone blew up because my family in Los Angeles, my folk in New York, immediately said, Jill, we just saw you walk across the site where the CVS is burning. What are you doing out there? I'm doing my job. I'm supposed to be out here. I'm observing because there are hundreds of police in riot gear right on this site. Right? This is riot gear in the context of New York City. Some like riot gear. Right? So when I'm training people, the first thing I ask them, tell me the tone and tenor of the police. Tone and tenor is what are they getting ready for? Look at what they're wearing. For those of you who've had any kind of interaction at protests, even if you've seen it on TV, you immediately recognize they're going to make mass arrests because they got flexi cuffs. Right? Flexi cuffs, you can immediately arrest people. Right? Normally the traditional standard cuffs are the metal ones. Right? So that's the first thing. As a legal observer, I know I need to get ready to start documenting because a lot of people might get arrested. Right? They're in riot gear. They've got shields, they've got batons. When you see officers like this, it means they're about to do an aggressive move to push people back. Because it's about command and control. Right? Officers who wear gloves tend to also like to be more aggressive and they also like to fight. Very similar to some protesters. Right? Let's be clear, folks. This is not a walk in the park. Right? This is about command and control. So as a legal observer, my doctorate students in the house, remember, we're talking about this is an observation technique, right? We just talked about data collection, right? How do you read people's body language? I read people's body language very well, right? But as I shared with you, I now know potentially what the police are getting ready to do, right? This is the level of training that you receive, and of course, the more you're in the street, because that's where it really rubber hits the ground. The more you're in the street in these activities, that's when it all comes together. So what is it the police like to do? It's all about command and control. At the end of the day, I don't care how they need to do it, they're going to want to command and control the crowd. And these are the ways in which they do it. Pop-up lines. Y'all are in the process of about to move forward, and all of a sudden you'll see a row of police will pop up. Now they can use their bicycles, called the bicycle squad. They can use their batons. They can use the metal barriers, they can use the orange nets, they can use whatever it is they're going to use to command and control this crowd to move it in the direction that they want it to go in. Pop-up lines, trapping. Look, trapping simply means this. The police want to arrest you, and technically, statute-wise, you are supposed to be, if you want to leave, you technically, legally are supposed to be able to leave a protest. But the police will trap you. They'll use the big orange net and they'll do a sweep. So even if you're not even in the protest, like in New York City, people coming off the subway, they got swept. And guess what? Once you get swept, you're going to go through the entire criminal justice system. You're going to be booked. You're going to possibly be put in jail, right? So trapping, you want to watch out for trapping. We know the things to look for. Orange nets, right? Kettling, another way to move people out of the way, right, and kettle them in a particular area. Technically, once I said to you, if you want to leave, you should be able to leave. It's not always the case. Checking bags, right? My understanding, working this and knowing street law and with my attorneys, that technically they have to have probable cause. And even then, you still have the right to say, I do not consent for my car or bags to be checked. It's one of our rights. Using force. Police use force, folks. That's just the reality. I don't care where you are in the world, police use force. Holding pedestrian traffic back, right? Snatch and grab. I don't know if they do that here. I haven't been out on the street here in Ethiopia. But in the context of the US, we have organizers. Very savvy organizers. Nobody like they're the lead organizers, right? The police know who they are because they track them across the country. And they will intentionally target them and basically grab them out of a group of people and arrest them. Or they're all, what I've seen, pile on the 10 or 12 police would just jump on them, including the female police officers, as I'm screaming at them. Really? You really had to like do that last jump? Like you were, I mean, so, which I'm not supposed to do. I'm not supposed to have a kind of interaction with the police, but when you see this, it's ridiculous, right? So snatch and grab. The purpose is to instill fear, because if you snatch and grab the head, the assumption is that everyone else, right, doesn't know what to do. But if you have a cell-type organizing principle, everyone is trained. It doesn't matter if one person can snatch because the cell can still, right, operate. The activists are incredibly savvy. Some of the tactical and police formation. So folks, I told you, I'm a photographer, videographer, and I catalog police equipment. So does anyone recognize the taser? Anyone from the States? Or maybe someone who just knows about tasers. Anybody recognize the less lethal weapon? It is a deadly weapon, but it's a less lethal weapon. Does anyone recognize it? Anyone recognize weapons? Anyone recognize 9mm guns, right? So here's the taser, folks. Tasers, and it's probably international, a color code. Green, yellow is a taser, right? So I can shoot you, right, and electrify you. Technically, it is they classify it as a non-lethal weapon, right? You can die from being tased, right? The baton, this is a standard baton. This is a baton used by the mounted police. I've interacted with both. Standard batons and the extended batons that the police can use. They can be up on the horses, right? I've dealt with mounted police and I've dealt with canines, right? Pepper spray. These are standard pepper spray canisters that are sold all over the world, right? So it's a whole industry. We now, for those of you who want to know the technicalities, a lot of this weaponry, it's military grade weapons. Right, so a lot of the stuff that gets used in military theaters around the world are now sold to local police departments, and so we have a militarized police department that is interacting with the civilian population. It technically violates international law. So once again, you have to know the law to understand that as a legal observer, I have to document this, because in the event an attorney wants to use international law, right, to make an argument that we've signed international conventions not to use military-grade weapons on civilian populations. These are all military-grade weapons, right? These are military tanks. Folks, this is Baltimore. So Kevlar gear, and it's all kinds of tanks that get rolled out, including something called a sound cannon, which is another non-lethal weapon that's used in a theater, and what it does is it can cripple you by the decibels. So depending on what level of decibel they turn this sound cannon on, not only can it bust your eardrums, it can cripple you. Not only do you have to be aware of the police, you have to be aware of counter-protesters. So I'm in McKinney, Texas. McKinney, Texas is an open carry state, which means that individuals can carry semi-automatic military-grade weapons, domestic-grade weapons. An individual that walked up onto one of the sites, I interviewed him because of LO. I needed to assess his level of danger to the crowd, to myself, right? You have to be aware of various types of counter-protesters that can pop up in this work. I'm going to pass this. This is just an entire process when you get processed in going through jail. So I'm just going to just get to the end because it takes. It's a process map. What happens when you get arrested? So that was the entire system of what happens when you get arrested, right? What happens as a legal observer? What is it that we starts the process? Someone gets arrested. This is the metadata. This is what I'm collecting. These are the possible charges: obstructing government administration. You're basically blocking a door. You are resisting arrest. You tell an officer, "Officer, I'm not doing anything." You're resisting arrest. Disorderly conduct, right? Criminal trespassing. These are some of the common charges that protesters basically get charged with. In terms of what we collect as legal observers: the date, the event, location, time of arrest, circumstances leading to arrest, legal name. We have to ask for legal name because there are some individuals who use aliases, and there are some individuals who are transgender, right? And so their self-selected gender is not their legal name. We have to be able to get this information in order to track them through, right, the jail system. Of course, they didn't get an identification number, right? We also identify whether or not there's the use of military-grade weapons. That information gets transferred to an intake person who's now returning into the system, right? And what happens? You're at a protest. You go to jail, go directly to jail. You're adjudicated at the courthouse. What's the disposition? You can either be given a desk appearance, we're going to release you on your own recognizance, or we're going to remand you back into custody. Folks, this is what I do, right? And so the question becomes, to what extent are systems like this, possible in the context of Ethiopia, right? Given your constitution, your legal framework, given your community level of the ability to organize and mobilize at the community level, the ability to do the public education, people who can do the public education around knowing your rights, people who have the technical skill sets who can build the systems or work with people globally. Because remember I told you, this was built by a strategic partner that I had, right? That's the question that I have and I leave to Ethiopians and my colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. K, for your well-elaborated presentation, and thank you for helping us understand the situation of Black community and their movement in the United States, and we are able to understand such kind of sophisticated systems can be established to protect the constitutional right of those people who participate in the movement. And thank you for giving us some historical background about the slavery in the United States. And I guess there are many questions that would be raised by participants because it's a very important issue, and there are lots of things to be learned from your presentation because we have been in a political movement. I don't know to what extent we are able to use the same model in our country because we are totally in different contexts. Do we have constitutional rights in the first place? That's the first question. So maybe there are questions that may be raised. So let me open the floor to the participants to raise questions and to reflect their views. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, the floor is open for you.
I know it's a lot of folks.
Let me break the silence. Thank you, Professor, really, for your nice presentation. Really, I learned a lot from it. I was thinking, can it be really customized and introduced to the Ethiopian context? That was a little bit my question. I mean, you develop these things within a world where everything is established and even have a right to access based on your place, whether it is at home or on the street or like that. But specifically when it comes to Ethiopia, I think what you show us, I mean, constitution is simply, I can say that it is superficial, I mean, nominal. It is not exercised at grassroots levels. What is written there is not grounded on the grassroots level. So how really we can do such legal observation system in a fragile country?
You know, my first response is, because I've not had an opportunity to speak to your activists, I've not had an opportunity, I've been teaching, I've not had an opportunity to sit down in a formal way to have conversations with how Ethiopian activists currently organize in this context, because you already are organizing. That last photo was a picture of individuals protesting, right? So clearly there are people here who are activists and organized in different ways. I would have to sit down with them and understand sort of what those models look like, right? I would then have to talk to them about what is it do they think they need that could facilitate them to be more effective at whatever aspects of the work they're doing. Right? So basically what I'm doing is like a needs analysis in order to even think about how a system could be designed, given the legal framework given the legal and police framework that currently exists here that I'm learning about. Once I understand and do a system sort of analysis, then I can actually talk about different possible models, right? But understanding that comes from Ethiopians. I cannot just sort of like transplant this. I need to understand what's going on the ground, your institutions, right, how they operate. What I do know is from friends of mine, everyone's talking to me now about like your system. Taxi car drivers, friends that I have in Bahir, and they are telling me about their personal experiences in your country. Everything from seeing people being killed, to being arrested, to what it really means like to live in a repressive situation. And so the more I understand, the more I can kind of sketch things, but it has to be in collaboration with Ethiopians. And I'm in a range of Ethiopians. So there's the activists, like I'm one part of this movement, I'm legal support. But there's a whole other group of actors who are the activists that I have to have conversation with. I hope to have conversation with your attorneys. I've had some conversation with some of your attorneys, but I know there's a group of attorneys that are involved in this. So all of these actors, stakeholders, would need to be in the room to even think about what aspects of this could be useful. That's my response.
The good news is, I think the change agent is searching for such legal supporting issues. I think so. I don't know the way you approach them. Even the change agents, that means the Dr. Ali teams, they like this installment of legal system at the moment. But the problem is at regional or peripheral levels. For example, whenever you are trying to install such issues, there are also resistances.
Of course. We have resistance. Look, what I did, because I just don't have time, but look, this is not being done without resistance. Please understand that people are being surveilled in the United States. People have been arrested. Activists have been killed. Right? Yeah. So please understand that even in the US context, there's a level of repression, right, that activists and legal workers and attorneys are operating in. right? That's a reality, I think, across the world in terms of if you would try to advance your rights, there's going to be a counter reaction. Hence why, in fact, you do want to have systems like this, and you do want to connect transnationally. So what I've seen is, because of the work that I do and some of the people that I know, we are literally in conversation with people all over the world. So an Ethiopian friend here called me. I don't know how I was trying to stay away from Ethiopia's legal stuff. Literally over the past 2 months. Literally over the past 2 months.
You better stay away.
Yeah, I'm trying to, yeah, I better stay away. An Ethiopian friend called me and asked me, an African immigrant who has a US green card was arrested, right? It was criminal. He called me and he said, Jill, do you know if he has the same rights as a US citizen? And so because of my understanding of the legal system and my contacts, I spoke to an Ethiopian attorney who happens to work for Human Rights Watch, who basically very quickly, all this took place like in a half hour, shared with me Ethiopia's criminal justice system. We kind of looked at this person's status. No, this person does not have the same rights as me as a US citizen, even though they're a green card holder, right? But what rights does he have? I was able to then give that and call my friend back all within a half hour and give him referrals in addition to this information. That's the kind of training you can do. That's the kind of training that you can do for non-lawyers. I'm a legal worker, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an attorney, right? So I would think that, and I would have to speak to these people who do this work. The Ethiopians who do the legal empowerment work, because that's the international term, the Ethiopians that do the legal empowerment work around knowing your rights, right, and knowing how the criminal justice system operates, that's the group of people. I know in terms of the US's role, because I understand that the US plays a major role in this, how your country is developing. I know that one of the priorities or objectives of the US, because I came across my email, was they want to support the public education and legal education of people on the ground, communities knowing their rights. That came out as an objective of the US government. There are people from the political scientists who were actually, someone was here at the American corner, who did something similar, like a Know Your Rights training. Right, so but my question is I always ask my Ethiopian colleagues is, what do you all want? What do you want? What do you need? And how can individuals like myself facilitate, right, those needs?
Thank you, Sponsor.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your presentation. I have learned a lot from your presentation. And as my colleagues have said, we have to take a lesson here so that we can adapt the system together with our governmental system or community. In the problem in our country, we have a legal framework, so it is not that much strong and rooted to the community level. The problem is no legal education. Everybody, especially at the community level, they know the law when it is violated for their right. So poor legal education. One. The other is poor organization. For instance, women and youth organizations are organized by themselves to vote and to fight and strengthen this, what you have said, mass defects. But they are not strong, they are poor. And they don't want to be independent even. So the problem is this. And to some extent, even not to some extent, that we have to strengthen also, when there is a need for mass defense, the floor is not that open. Somebody will catch you somewhere, you will not be allowed to vote to just raise your issues freely. And because of these problems, the activists are not that much encouraged in our country. In fact, this time they are coming. Even they are coming from America to just mobilize Ethiopians here for Ethiopian citizens' rights. So this is a problem that we have, and we have to just take a lesson from this slavery system, how you have tried to just empower every segment of the institution in the public to vote for their rights. So I benefited this from your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Elu. Additional views?
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. And I think we should, if you have anything to say before I wind up the program.
The only observation that I had is actually an experience. I came here September 11th, Ethiopian New Year's, and I arrived when there was a slight civil unrest in Addis. And the news and what people on the street were saying to me was Oromo youth. There were interactions or altercations with Oromo youth, and people were describing it. Like, this is just people talking to me and information I've seen on the news. You know, how they were dressed and they carried the walking sticks. Now, mind you, I have no social context for the Oromo youth. It's outside of my social structure, my system. But when I began to see young men, because it's gendered and it's age, dressed like that, I began to become fearful. Like, I was becoming socialized to be fearful of Oromo youth. So I was conscious enough to realize that I was going through a process the same way that the US has socialized, right, different groups to be fearful of those who've been of African activity or racialized as Black. And I said, I wonder to what extent do the Ethiopian people realize that the media, because that's how it gets primarily transmitted, right? That through the media, that there's a possibility that they are socializing people to have fear against different groups within Ethiopia. And as I was walking down the street, talking to a merchant, I saw some Oromo youth coming down. They stood behind me and they started whatever. I don't even know what they were saying. They were dancing. They were singing. They were chanting. That's my interpretation. Right behind me. I froze. I did not move. I did not turn around. Once they left, I asked the store owner what was it they were saying. She said, "Oh, this is their Christmas, or this is their holiday. They're just doing they go to store, and they're doing their, whatever it is that they do." And I realized, right then and there, that I had become like petrified, right, of the Oromo, of these young male Oromo youth. And so, I guess I would say to my fellow Ethiopians is you are right. You're at a very critical moment in terms of how you're going to address these pressing issues that you have, and to be very aware and cognizant of not wanting to socialize people into being fearful about other groups of people, because it can, as you already see, in different contexts, can be very harmful.
Yeah.
And that's it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and we'll be back next week with another interesting issue.